The silence of dawn in Japan, the rivers flowing between mountains, the murmur of the wind through the cherry blossoms. In this landscape of beauty and discipline, a figure emerged, destined to mark history. Warriors who seemed to live by an unbreakable code. Loyalty, honor, sacrifice. But behind the serenity of the landscapes and the nobility of their gestures lies a much more complex truth. A story of power, war, and manipulation. Today, we'll travel beyond the myth to discover the true story. Samurai between honor and manipulation. To understand who the samurai were, we must first travel back in time, long before shining armor, sharp katanas, and the myth of the honorable warrior. Japan, in its early days, was not the unified and powerful nation we imagine today. It was a patchwork of clans, a fragmented territory where survival depended as much on land as on strength. In the 8th century, Japan lived under an imperial system inspired by the Chinese model. The emperor, in theory, held all the power, but in practice, his authority barely extended to the regions closest to the capital. Beyond that, in rural areas, it was the local clans, called uji, who exercised true control. And in this context of constant struggles for land and privileges, the need for something more than armed peasants arose. The figure of the professional warrior emerged. The first samurai were not yet the symbols of honor that history would turn into legend. They were, in essence, elite guards. Their primary function was to protect the estates of the great landowners, known as daimyos. These feudal lords vied with each other, and the emperor, unable to maintain order throughout the country, ended up relying on these powerful families and their private warriors. Thus were born the first saburao, a word meaning those who serve. Over time, that term transformed into what we know today, samurai. They were men bound by loyalty to a lord, and their lives were marked by the sword and obedience. But we were still far from the rigid code of Bushido. In these early stages, what defined the samurai was, above all, the ability to fight and survive. Japan was experiencing turbulent times. From the 9th century onward, internal wars multiplied. Two clans, in particular, began to dominate the scene: the Taira and the Minamoto. Their clashes would culminate in the conflict known as the Genpei Wars at the end of the 12th century. It was a bloody war, but also a decisive one. From it emerged not only victors and vanquished, it also gave rise to the shogunate. a system that would completely transform Japanese politics. To understand it, imagine it this way. The emperor continued to exist, but his power became almost ceremonial. The real figure of command passed to the shogun, the supreme military leader, and behind him, the samurai became the backbone of the entire system. Their duty was no longer merely to protect the lands, but to maintain order throughout the country through force of arms. It is here that the samurai begins to define themselves not only as soldiers, but as a social class. They were born into warrior families, received training from childhood, and inherited the duty to serve their lord. Their education was strict. From a young age, they learned to ride horses, shoot a bow, and later to master the sword. But they were also instilled with a discipline that went beyond the physical. And here, we find one of the keys to their evolution, the philosophical principles that would begin to permeate their lives. Zen Buddhism taught them to control their minds and accept death with serenity. Confucianism taught them to respect hierarchy and unconditional loyalty. Little by little, the martial and spiritual aspects merged, sowing the seeds of what we would later call Bushido, the way of the warrior. However, we must avoid overly romanticizing this early period. The life of a samurai was far from secure or glorious. Yes, they were feared and respected, but they were also subject to the fragility of power. If their lord fell from grace, they fell with him. Thus were born the Ronin, masterless, wandering samurai, often condemned to poverty and dishonor. Their existence is proof that the supposed solidity of the system had deep cracks. In this historical context, the samurai ceased to be mere private guards and became Japan's dominant military class. From protectors of lands, they became the very essence of power. But this transformation didn't happen overnight. It was the result of centuries of struggle, alliances, and bloodshed. And over time, it would shape an ideal that would outlast their battles. Thus, as Japan entered the Middle Ages, the samurai was no longer just an armed man. He was part of a social, political, and spiritual structure that would shape the country's destiny for nearly 700 years. And at the heart of that transformation, the myth began to take shape. Becoming a samurai wasn't a simple destiny. It was a life marked from childhood. The family was the first school, the foundation of everything. A child born into a samurai household didn't grow up surrounded by luxuries or comforts. Their path was written from day one: to serve, fight, and die if necessary for their lord. From the earliest years, their education combined the physical with the spiritual. They learned to ride a horse, to string a bow, to wield a lance. Discipline wasn't a punishment. It was the air they breathed. Every gesture was imbued with ritual. Even everyday activities, such as eating or greeting, became constant reminders of obedience and respect. But it wasn't all about combat. Young men were also taught poetry, calligraphy, and music. For the Japanese, a warrior wasn't complete if he only mastered the sword. He had to cultivate his mind as much as his body. Serenity, beauty, and balance permeated their daily lives, teaching them that war and art could coexist in unison. Zen Buddhism played a fundamental role here. Through meditation, samurai learned to accept death as an immutable certainty. A samurai had to always be prepared to die, without fear, without doubt. This serenity, in the face of life's end, gave them a strength that terrified their enemies. Because how do you defeat a man who doesn't fear death? At the same time, Confucianism contributed the hierarchical structure. In its worldview, each person had a defined place. The lord at the top, the vassal at the bottom. Loyalty was absolute, without room for discussion. Duty to the daimyo was above personal desires. And this obedience, reinforced by honor, became the backbone of the samurai spirit. From this fusion of practices, Zen meditation, Confucian morality, and strict martial discipline, Bushido, the way of the warrior, eventually emerged. But beware, Bushido was not a written code from the outset. It was not a manual engraved in stone. Rather, it was a series of ideals that evolved over centuries, transmitted through oral tradition and daily practice. Bushido was based on 7 main virtues: gi, justice, always acting in accordance with what was right, even if it entailed great sacrifice. Yu, courage. Bravery was not the absence of fear, but the ability to face and overcome it. Jin, compassion. Although it may sound contradictory, a samurai was expected to protect the weak and act with benevolence. Rei, respect. Treating superiors, equals, and even enemies with dignity was a sign of strength. Makoto, honesty. A samurai's word was as sacred as a written oath. Meio, honor. Reputation was more valuable than life itself. Losing it was tantamount to death. Chugi, loyalty. The unbreakable bond between samurai and lord, above all else. But these ideals, though noble, also conceal a dark side, because Bushido left no room for weakness. Those who defrauded their lord or lost their honor had only one dignified way out: seppuku. This ritual, also known in the West as harakiri, consisted of slicing open one's own stomach with one's own sword. It was a painful death, but laden with symbolism. The stomach, considered the center of the soul, had to be exposed to demonstrate sincerity and courage until one's last breath. Seppuku became one of the most feared and respected practices of samurai culture. For many, it was the ultimate proof that honor was paramount over life. For others, it was a brutal reminder that the system would not forgive even the slightest slip. Either way, the message was clear. The path of the warrior offered no easy way out. The existence of the Ronin reinforced this fragility. These masterless samurai, abandoned after the defeat or death of their patron, were a living example of how relentless fate could be. Some survived as mercenaries or bandits, others as wandering masters, but all carried the burden of having lost their place in the social order. And in a world where honor was everything, that was almost worse than death. Over the centuries, Bushido became established as the ideal that gave meaning to the samurai life. Not everyone followed it to the letter, of course. Reality was full of contradictions, political interests, and ruthless wars. But the myth of the noble and disciplined warrior grew to become an essential part of Japan's identity. And here, we must pause for a moment. Because the fascinating thing about Bushido is that it didn't just shape warriors, it shaped an entire nation. For centuries, samurai weren't just soldiers in the service of their lords. They were role models, exemplars of discipline, symbols of a way of life that transcended war. Their influence seeped into politics, into art, into the way the Japanese understood honor and community. Thus, by the time Japan entered its era of unification and stability under the Tokugawa shogunate, the samurai were no longer mere warriors. They were guardians of a code, bearers of a tradition that elevated them above any other class. And yet, the very rigidity that made them great would be the seed of their decline. For centuries, medieval Japan was the scene of endless battles. Rival clans fought for control of territory under a feudal system where each daimyo sought to expand his power. And amidst this chaos, the samurai shone as the elite of combat. They were the men who decided the fate of entire provinces, the warriors whose loyalty could tip the balance of a war. One of the decisive moments came in 1600 with the Battle of Sekigahara. There, more than 160,000 combatants clashed in a titanic clash that sealed Japan's future. The victor, Tokugawa Ieyasu, not only gained military control, he founded the Tokugawa shogunate, a regime that would maintain peace for more than 250 years. And with that peace, the role of the samurai began to transform. With the country unified under a central power, major wars were no longer necessary. Suddenly, an entire class of warriors trained for combat found themselves without wars to fight. The samurai moved into administrative positions, becoming bureaucrats and officials of the shogunate. Their swords, once bathed in blood, now hung as they signed documents or oversaw taxes. This change brought internal tensions. Many samurai accepted their new role, but others experienced it as a humiliation. How could a man, educated to die on the battlefield, find meaning in the routine of an office? This contradiction marked the 17th and 18th centuries. Samurai caught between warrior tradition and a new society that no longer needed their swords. At the beginning of the 18th century, Japan lived under the strict peace of the Tokugawa shogunate. But that peace did not mean justice for all. The samurai were subject to a rigid system where loyalty to the Lord was the basis of their existence. In 1701, a feudal lord named Asano Naganori was publicly humiliated by a high-ranking court official, Kira Yoshinaka. Unable to bear the insult, Asano drew his sword inside the shogun's palace, an unforgivable crime. He was forced to commit seppuku, and his clan was dissolved. His retainers became ronin, masterless samurai, men who had lost everything: honor, land, and purpose. For nearly 2 years, they lived like shadows, feigning resignation. But secretly, they plotted their revenge. The cold winter of 1703 witnessed their attack. Armed and organized, they stormed Kira's residence, captured him, and executed him. The next day, they marched together to their lord's tomb and laid Kira's head as an offering. They had done their duty. The shogun faced a dilemma: punish them as criminals or acknowledge their loyalty. Finally, they were allowed to die honorably by seppuku. The story of the 47 Ronin was not just an anecdote. It mirrored the contradictions of feudal Japan. It showed that the ideal of Bushido could lead men to challenge even the established order. That loyalty, taken to the extreme, could be more powerful than the law itself. The real blow to the samurai came in the 19th century. Japan, isolated for centuries, was forced to open its ports to international trade after the arrival of Commodore Perry's black ships in 1853. The country was pushed toward modernization and contact with the West. By the end of the 19th century, Japan was no longer the same. The Meiji Restoration had modernized the country at a forced pace. Railroads, factories, rifles imported from the West. The old feudal system was abolished, and with it, the privileges of the samurai class. Many of them were left ruined, unable to adapt to a world where they could no longer live off stipends or brandish their katana in public. Among the discontented was Saigo Takamori, the last samurai. A samurai from the Satsuma domain, he had initially supported modernization, but soon saw it as a betrayal of the Japanese spirit. For him, the Meiji government was selling the soul of the country to the West. In 1877, he rallied tens of thousands of former samurai in southern Japan. It wasn't just an armed rebellion. It was a desperate cry against the disappearance of everything the warrior class stood for. The war was brutal. They faced modern armies equipped with artillery and rifles, while they charged forward with swords and tactics from the past. At first, they achieved surprising victories, demonstrating that discipline and courage could still prevail. But the technological gap was insurmountable. Takamori fell, and with him, the last uprising of the samurai class. The Satsuma uprising didn't halt modernization, but it remained in memory as the last roar of the samurai, an inevitable clash between tradition and progress, and proof that, even in defeat, the warrior spirit could transcend death. However, the samurai never completely disappeared. Their code, Bushido, survived and adapted. It inspired the Imperial Japanese Army in the 20th century and still permeates the values of Japanese culture today: work discipline, family honor, respect for hierarchy. Even outside Japan, the samurai became a universal myth. Their image has been recreated in film, literature, and video games. They are seen as symbols of honor, discipline, and strength, although their true history is sometimes idealized and simplified. The truth is more complex. They were also executioners, mercenaries, and enforcers of an unequal system that kept millions of peasants in poverty. Bushido taught self-control and loyalty, but it also justified violence and blind sacrifice. Samurai could be guardians, or butchers, inspirational, or ruthless. The history of the samurai is the history of a people who found their reason for being in discipline and honor. A path that shaped centuries of politics, war, and art. But it is also the history of men forged in violence, caught between duty and ambition, between glory and blood. A class doomed to disappear by the changes of history, unable to stop the march of time. And yet, the echo of their swords still resonates every time we think of sacrifice, of loyalty, of honor taken to its ultimate consequences. We think of them, yes. They were a symbol of honor, but they were also soldiers for hire, executors of endless wars, cogs in a system that used and discarded them. Between light and shadow, between honor and manipulation, they built a myth that still fascinates us today. The samurai were mortal, yes, but their spirit became immortal. The question is inevitable. Do we remember the samurai for what they truly were, or for what we need to believe they were? Did the samurai really die? Or do they live on in each of us, in what we understand by courage, honor, and discipline?